Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Adrienne Charles. Adrienne is Senior Consulting Curator at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. She's been an associate at the W.E.B. Dubois Institute at Harvard, has published extensively on the Black figure in European art. I first met her in 2020 when she curated Rift and Relation, African American artists in the European modernist tradition at the Phillips Collection. She and I then co-curated The Color of Anxiety, Race, Sexuality, and Disorder in Victorian Sculpture at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, which was great because I actually got to meet her in person, whereas before we'd only been chatting on Zoom. And it was then that I learned of her love of cocktails. And I have very happy memories of sharing some cocktails with her during her visit to the UK. We are both drinking these knees, and Adrienne is going to share the recipe for her business at the end of the talk. Her latest project is a book entitled Ornamental Blackness, The Black Figure in European Decorative Art, which is going to be published soon by Yale University Press. And today, Adrienne's going to talk to me about the Harlem Renaissance, which, as some of you will know, is the subject of a apparently fantastic exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Sadly, I haven't been to New York yet to see it, but I've watched, whatever I can watch and read whatever I can read. And there have been a number of reviews which have all praised it very much. The exhibition is, I think, particularly exciting because it's the first time in 50 years the Met has come to this topic after rather disastrous, I believe, exhibition in the 1970s. Is that right, Adrienne?
Yes. Thank you for inviting me. And it's interesting that this is happening in 2024, Harlem Renaissance. And in the 70s, there was a major exhibition at the Met called Harlem on My Mind. That was an exhibition in response to a lot of protests because Black people weren't being represented in major museums. But the exhibition was more of sort of an anthropology or ethnography of Harlem. There were no artists involved. There were no Black curators. There was no art being shown. It was photographs and sort of documenting Harlem. So there was a lot of pushback against that. So now it's come full circle. Whether or not they would admit or say that it was a response, I'm not sure, but it certainly does focus on the great flourishing of art that came out of Harlem. It's a learning curve the art museums have gone through.
Right. Well, that's really interesting. So, Adrienne, let's start. Tell us a little bit about the period leading up to the so-called Harlem Renaissance, and then what it was.
I'm starting here with what we call with the Americanists and people studying American art, American history, the New Negro movement, because the New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance are often even not confused with each other, but kind of dovetail. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, the major sort of thinker, figure, historian, sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois could be sort of credited with spearheading or this movement of Black intellectualism, the rise of Black middle class, the thinking about sort of the era after slavery has ended, after Reconstruction, and as Black people are fighting for civil rights, and coming into the new century with a new idea about how Black people should be participating in politics. I mean, it's a very big project of uplift, a project of progressive thinking. The experience of slavery, it didn't just end the day that slavery was over. So there's a big concerted effort on those who had been able to become educated, et cetera, and be part of the political system to bring a collective uplift. So Du Bois is at the head of this. And so what's interesting is, I think it's a nice place to start with this, thinking about imagery and the way things look, and we're going to be talking about art, is that Du Bois very much understood what the power of the image. And he brought to the 1900 exhibition, Universal Exposition in Paris, a whole display called the American Negro, to really present to the world the progress or the lack of progress or the situation of Black people in America in ways that I don't think were ever really presented in Europe. And so you see here a picture of Du Bois sitting in the American Negro exhibit in Paris in 1900. And it was in like an agricultural hall, again, sort of being put just like the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, kind of a sociological or sort of scientific space. But at any rate, he brought photographs that he had commissioned of people who were in politics, in education, etc. He brought photographs such as this piece here in the middle of the Victorian interior. He focused it on Negro life in Georgia. So he had photographs taken of, like I said, this sort of elegant interior, and then he also had photographs taken of some of the rural life and some of the leftovers of sort of the Jim Crow South, if you will, the segregated South, where the vestiges of slavery are still being seen here with this family out in this kind of ramshackle yard. But so he's kind of trying to give the whole breadth of that, because when we start thinking about this Harlem Renaissance, it's all about identity making. It's all about presenting yourself, your people, your story. And here he is in 1900 in Paris telling the story. And really a big part of the story was the people. Who are the people? And showing that American Negroes are not all primitive, because listen, at the Universal Fairs, you might have an exhibition of Africans that are in a cage or in a zoo-like setting. So this is countering all of those kind of notions of primitivism that you find in Europe that relate to people of African descent. So he's got women here who are students sitting on the front steps. He's got of an education, or probably a school. He's got a young girl being taught piano. He's got a group of musicians here, all very elegantly dressed, etc. In fact, this piece here on the left with the women, this is a very famous photograph that gets riffed on over and over and over again. Like other artists come back and they take these four women and they've made them into quilts and other paintings. So they're very well known. And so one of the things that this is doing, this new Negro, is refuting what we think of as the old Negro. So how are you new? There's got to be an old, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And so who is this old Negro? What is he trying to, not just he, but many others who get involved in image making? What are they trying to do? They're trying to show that the way we were represented as the subject of art and image making, that was not just stereotypical, but it was a method of control. And there's nothing more stereotypical, especially at this time, at turn of the century, Gilded Age era, is the Currier and Ives prints. They talked about all walks of American life, and they have a whole series called Darktown Follies, or the Darktown series. I mean, it's so bad I can't even say it. But I just show that to show this banjo playing group here, with very stereotypical, very buffoonish. And this is exactly what Du Bois is trying to counter, to show the world that, oh no, we are more than that. We are not that. And so this sort of this dichotomy between, quote unquote, the old Negro and the new Negro.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, because I mean, obviously, I knew about the Harlem Renaissance, and I knew that there were these kind of quite elite, educated figures like Du Bois, but I think that the prevailing view in Europe was still, apart from kind of very glamorous figures like Josephine Baker, the prevailing view was, I think, still more, I don't think he won the PR argument, as far as I can tell. I don't know what the reception was in the rest of Europe, to this thing, whether it changed people's minds, or whether, as we know, people just keep thinking what they've always thought, and it takes a long time to change their minds.
That's interesting, because I think of the early 20th century, the jazz age, and the craze for jazz in Europe, all of the Black performance. There was still a lot of minstrelsy going on. So yes, but also, and they still thought of Black people as sort of, basically primitive. But there was that sort of a lust for Black culture in its all of its primitive excitement that Josephine Baker kind of represented. But I think musicians really were really important, and there's the military in World War I. There's a lot of little bits and pieces of changes, but it's still somewhat tied to these old tropes. So what is going on in the Harlem Renaissance? When we say that, we think we're talking about this a period when Black people from the South are moving north, getting away from the failure of Reconstruction. It didn't work then because they have this horrible Black backlash against people. They can't find jobs. They're there's lynchings. It's a terrible situation. So they're moving north to urban cities. Harlem becomes a hub, and James Van Der Zee, the famous photographer, is taking photographs of this new class. I mean, not all the people that are coming are riding around in this fabulous car with the fur coats.
Amazing, this photograph. Yeah.
This is an amazing photograph, but it is absolutely indicative of that new energy that we're talking about, that's springing up in Harlem at the time. Van Der Zee was, they found his photographs years after his plates. And it was a treasure trove. That's one of the things that Harlem on My Mind did do, is to.
Was he a Black photographer, Van Der Zee?
Yeah, his name is a Dutch name, but he was a Black photographer, and he had a shop in Harlem, and he took pictures of people all the way up through the late 20th, later 20th century. He lived to be an old man. But what is going on in the arts? One of the major things was this education that takes you abroad, right, to Paris. And the first major Black artist who goes to Paris is Henry Ossawa Tanner. Here's a portrait of him in the middle. And Tanner is, I would say, definitely influenced by Impressionism, symbolism. We see his haystacks there on the left. He was from Philadelphia, but he goes to Paris because he's admitted into the education system, the Pennsylvania Academy, but he's harassed there. He's like many of the other artists, going for a minute or a year, and then ends up staying his whole life. And he becomes a well-known painter there. But what he does there is he's very involved in spirituality, Christianity, and he doesn't address the quote unquote Negro subject. And the issue of the Harlem Renaissance artists, or the artists of the new Negro movement, is like, who's going to define us? Tanner does one major or maybe two major paintings of Black life. One of them is a banjo lesson that you look at on the right, and he's very influenced by sort of French painting you see there.
And it's quite sentimental, isn't it?
It's a sentimental piece, and
it's lovely, but sentimental. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's a piece that, had he continued in this vein to represent Black life in America, which would be with the banjo. Again, here's the banjo. That would have sort of pleased the critics, his Black critics, that were saying, look, he's achieved so much, but he's not representing us. His choice was biblical subjects. And so there's that tug of war, that happens all the time. So, but he is a precursor because he is actually professional. He goes to North Africa. I mean, he's the first Black artist to really travel in Africa and represent Africans. He's still sort of in the Orientalist vein, but it's a major story, and people are very proud of him. He's in, and it opens sort of a floodgate for artists to come later who are more interested in modernism. Tanner even says, I'm not interested in modernism. He's not interested in what Picasso is doing or Matisse. He's more kind of like a symbolist, right? And then the other early major Black artist is Fuller, right? What's interesting here is that it was still unusual for a woman to be in sculpture, regardless of their race. But at any rate, she's from Philadelphia, also middle-class family, upper middle-class family, who was able to afford to send her there. She goes there, and you hear many stories. Immediately, she goes to the boarding house she was staying in, and they took one look at her and say, you can't stay here. So you're still facing
absolutely
racism, but at any rate, she was interested in Rodin, and you might hear stories that she studied with Rodin. I don't think she studied with Rodin, but she did go to his studio and see him, and was certainly influenced, like everyone else who was interested in what was really modern. Rodin was very modern, so that's why I put this Danse Macabre on the side to show the Rodin influence. It looks like the gates of hell. But her contribution to this notion of the Harlem Renaissance was this Ethiopia awakening, looking at a quote unquote Black subject, liberation of Ethiopia. And it's sort of an awakening of not only this African country, but an awakening of Black consciousness that is represented by Black people, that she's credited with being an early Harlem Renaissance person. So the new Negro movement gets, energy. And I guess what we think of as the thing that starts or represents the big flowering of the Harlem Renaissance is this volume of essays and the other contributions edited by Alain Locke, who is also another philosopher, art connoisseur, collector, writer, lecturer. And he is the one who's literally defining who this new Negro is. And he calls it a new psychology. Younger generations, the myth of the old Negro has to be stamped out, and it's a social awakening, and art is very much tied into it, but it's also a literary movement. And actually, the Harlem Renaissance is more literary than it is visual art.
And there's that wonderful poet Langston Hughes, isn't there?
Oh,
He's
yes.
Really influential, yeah.
And in this volume, The New Negro, which is still in press, published, it's really an interesting thing. You have poetry, you have photographs of African art, which is very important. You have short stories, you have folk tales and music. This drawing is a portrait of Locke that is done by Winhold Reis. I like saying that to practice my German. It sounds terrible, excuse me. But Reis was one of the early artists that took up the mantle with Locke. And then it's interesting, Locke said that the Black artists, when he was looking for somebody to illustrate the new Negro, the Black artists were not quite there yet. So he's kind of got his own elitist prejudices. He studied in Germany, traveled extensively. He was a Rhodes Scholar, Harvard, and all that. And Rice does a fantastic portrait. So I think he nails it. But he needed someone to represent people.
And yet Locke is still very, very much going back to, as the picture you see here, the notion of African art that's very what the Europeans thought of at that time as primitive. But he says, that's the art that we must go back to. That's where our identity starts. And he redefines it, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. But his introduction to African art is through European modernism, and it's through Europe, because there's not a lot of African art floating around the United States at that time. And he's getting it through his experiences in Paris. He's buying little bits and pieces. Well, some of them are buying it, and in Germany. And so it's through a colonial kind of lens, if you will. I don't know if his lens was colonial, but it's the reason these objects are even there in the first place is because of colonialism. And then the artists at the time aren't putting those two things together, but he is saying to them, these European artists are defining the modern self through this what they think of as primitive objects. Sort of the pared down self, the unvarnished, uncivilized, and all of that through African art. This is our legacy, and so we need to take it and use it, right? And so he does kind of represent. He's looking at artists like the Schmidt-Rottluff here, the German artist who is engaged with African art, and German expressionism becomes very important. This book on the left side called Afrikanische Plastik was something that was touted, and a lot of artists saw that. There were photographs of African plastic arts, African sculpture, that then influenced artists of all different stripes. Now we're getting into what we're calling the Harlem Renaissance time. And I think the Harlem Renaissance is tied into modernism to a certain extent for these early artists, filtered through this kind of European experience. And that's where they're getting their access to African art. It's coming into the United States. Stieglitz is bringing it in, it's coming in with the modernists. But Black artists are trying to make their own out of it. Here's Hale Woodruff, who's from Indiana, Black artist who goes and stays in Paris and does his own responses to Cézanne, who he's very interested in. You can even see by the brushwork here. And I had this Carl Schmidt-Rottluff and the Hale Woodruff in Rifts and Relations. And I just thought it was kind of interesting to see these women at a table, the kind of cubist perspective you have at the table tilting, et cetera. And then Woodruff's mask-like heads. And so he's experimenting. He sees, say, a big Cézanne retrospective when he lives in Paris. So there's a lot of these kind of relationships, but he's building a language. And so these objects, like this one in particular, would be sent back, these paintings, to the United States, and they go on tour with the Harman Foundation. The Harman Foundation was a foundation that was trying to support Black artists, and it would gather objects and send them on tours around the United States, showing the art of Black America, Negro in art, if they would call it. And they would get some from the artists who were still living abroad. And so this one toured around. And so they're starting to filter.
And was that, when those paintings were taken on tour, was it primarily Black audiences that came to see them, or was it mixed?
No,
I mean, how
I think they
received?
were mixed. I think they were mixed because the foundation was a quote unquote white foundation led by white women, but they would have to be in places like libraries. And I mean, they're not going to the Metropolitan Museum,
no.
but they're going to places where the point of these exhibitions was to showcase the art of Black Americans,
Right.
So the Harlem Foundation is spreading this Harlem Renaissance word, if you will. But I brought this in. Both of these are in the show at the Harlem Renaissance show at the Met. Palmer Hayden, who's also in Paris at the same time, they played cards together, he and Woodruff, and both of their sort of interpretations of hanging out. And there was a group of Black artists, and not only artists, writers and things that were coming together in Paris. Think about it. I mean, how much fun is that?
It looks like fun, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And they're defining the modern self and the international self. So this is another gentleman, Archibald Motley, who came to Paris. A lot of them received grants from foundations and things to travel, and they usually didn't have a lot of money. And then later on in the 50s, people start getting the GI Bill after World War II, but it was hard to get there. So there was Rosenwald Foundation, things like that. Harman Foundation would also give money. But anyway, Motley came. He didn't take to Paris like the others did, but he did some really interesting paintings that show the interracial experience, the jazz experience in Paris in ways that, you don't typically get. That painting is in the show. And also other artists like William H. Johnson, and he was very interested in formalism, meaning that he was interested in that kind of expressive handwork of people like Van Gogh, and he really got interested in Soutine. And he stayed in Denmark for a while. He traveled through Paris, and he got involved. He saw a Soutine show, and then actually literally followed his footsteps down to Cagnes-sur-Mer, where Soutine did many views of this really picturesque little town. So at this point, he's not defining a Black aesthetic. He's looking for his own language.
But he changes a lot over the course of time, doesn't he?
Yes, and he's, to me, one of, if I'm going to say best, we're not supposed to say best or hierarchies, but that doesn't even make any sense to me, really. I'm old enough to say he's one of the best in terms, I think, artists of this era. Anyway, back at home, there are some artists that did not travel much, but they stayed at home and defined what the Harlem Renaissance was. And that artist is the Aaron Douglas, who was a student of Winold Reiss, the German painter, portraitist that brought him on these projects. And he becomes the chronicler, if you will, of the Harlem Renaissance, or chronicler of African-American history. Here's a very famous mural, Aspects of Negro Life, where they're telling their story from slavery to, picking cotton, to freedom, from rural to urban, and all of that in a very much sort of Art Deco and what Rick Powell's called the Afro Deco style.
It's interesting to me that this is at the Schomburg Center at the New York Public Library, because, the show at the Met is about Juan de Pareja, Velázquez's assistant. And Arturo Schomburg, who this is named after, was this great historian from the same period who went to Spain, to Seville, to really tell the story of Black Africans in Seville who were brought to Seville and then brought all this material back to the States and created this amazing archive. This is a mural, right?
Yes. Well, yes, of course. And the Schomburg is such a great repository of the wonderful archives. Again, this notion of Africa as a source of aesthetic and not just cultural pride, an aesthetic guide really comes through in Douglas's work. But it's interesting when they say Africa, where it's still kind of nebulous. In Africa, there's still a mythology going on around Africa.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of understanding about the differences between the different cultures, whether it's Nigerian or anything. So you get this kind of mythologized Africa. So
But he didn't travel, did he, Aaron Douglas?
not then, not at this point.
Yeah.
I don't think
Yeah.
there's a lot of travel.
Yeah.
There's certainly not a lot of travel to Africa till much
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
But he does this Negro in an African setting, again, very kind of primitive, if you will. And it's beautiful, but there's still sort of a primitivist feel to this. There are some pitfalls in working during this time. And so one of them was he was hired to do book illustration. So what I'm showing is a book illustration for this book by Carl Van Vechten. You see the title, the Harlem Renaissance, being made mostly a literary movement. Say this is a major piece, but written by a white writer and photographer. And he's thinking that he's doing something about, showing and revealing modern Harlem life, but it is patronizing and kind of stereotypical in some ways. Some people loved it, some people didn't. And then Douglas is hired to illustrate. So that to me, so these kind of compromises that have to be made, but the illustrations are fantastic, right? So this is, how do we parse this? He's also hired to illustrate sort of racist book, if you will, by Paul Morin called Magie Noire, about, primitive Black people in Haiti and New York and Paris. But he does these wonderful illustrations. This one is called Congo. So there's a kind of a push and pull of how to present, and because there's a lot of people involved in this mania for Black culture, and it still gets stereotyped in some ways. So it's a matter, everyone is sort of working through these new ideas. There is also the notion that the body, not just the physical body, but the persona, the fashion, the hair, the Black beings are misrepresented, right? And so there's also the idea of kind of a Victorian respectability that you see a lot of Black middle-class people aspiring to, like we saw with the interiors of Victorian homes. And that was the standard of the day. And what are they going to live in, a hut? I mean, it's the standard of the day, and they want to be seen on the terms of everyone else. So portraiture became very important. And Laura Wheeler Waring was a very traditional portrait painter who has not been investigated nearly enough. And you have to hand it to the curator.
Denise Morel. Yeah. Denise Morel. Yeah.
Who dug up a lot of these portraits by Waring. Some of them they're named people, some of them are not known, but showing sort of this kind of interest in Black respectability and Black beauty. And I'm not surprised that it's a female portrait painter who we find that is engaged like this. And then a lot of times women artists were just portrait painters rather than history painters, right? Charles Alston, Girl in a Red Dress. A little bit more modernist, he's looking at people like Modigliani, etc. But the point is Black beauty, and in all of its diversity, is something that is very important to Harlem Renaissance artists. Now we go back to William H. Johnson, who is interested in this too, but he is much more of a modernist. And that's one of the reasons I think of him as standing out in the crowd, because he comes up with his own aesthetic influenced by Picasso. You can see that in Matisse, and big, large hands, large heads, color blocks, very vibrant and stunning, exciting color. And so this is another piece by William Johnson. His influence, he's the one who was also traveled in France and Europe and was very much influenced by the French modernists, but brings that to looking at Black life, and not just the new Negro, but the old. Here's an old one, it's probably his grandmother or someone in his family. These are also portraits by Johnson. He's doing nudes. We don't see nudes very much in African-American art at all during the first half of the 20th century. Very rarely do we see nudes, but having had that European influence, I think Johnson is—
he got corrupted.
Yes. And he's also looking at Harlem nightlife. So if we think about the photograph from Z and Johnson's paintings, this is the essence of what the Harlem Renaissance is about: modernity, urbanity, and self-definition.
I can see why you say he's the most interesting.
Yeah. And of course it's childlike in some, if you will, but you see he's gone through an academic training. He was at the Art Students League all the way through the European training. And he's come to this really exciting aesthetic.
Yeah.
I think. Now, and then I also put this, and he really at the end of his life, unfortunately, he is institutionalized for many, many years. He doesn't paint, and all of his works are sequestered away. The Harman Foundation had to literally do some kind of injunction to get them out of storage. But toward the end of his life, he comes to this very reduced childlike renderings. And it's interesting that I saw this after I put this together, that how much this work, Farm Family, kind of echoes what we see here in the Dubois's photo from the American Negro exhibition of the young people, the mother and the farmhouse, etc. So one of the things about the Harlem Renaissance is that they're looking at the new Negro, but they're also, like I said, looking back at rural folk life and defining folk life in ways that were not terribly stereotypical. So what kind of afterlife does the Harlem Renaissance have? One of the things that I brought was a couple of pieces by Faith Ringgold. One of them is the dinner at Gertrude Stein's, thinking about Paris as a location of freedom, etc. And this is the dinner at Gertrude Stein's is a fantasy dinner. I mean, they weren't all there together, but you have people who were Paris, James Baldwin, you have Richard Wright, who lived in Paris, you have Ernest Hemingway. All of them knew Gertrude Stein, by the way, but they weren't all there for dinner. And so there's this sort of kind of mythology, I guess, around that coming together of intellectuals. And then this, on the hand, you have this sort of riff challenging Picasso in terms of the race issues around the Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. So all of this is still coming out of this repartee, I guess, of really finding a voice.
Yeah. I think, Adrienne, you know what? I think we might leave it there, because we were going to try and talk, if we had time, about the kind of legacy, even today. But I think we should open to questions, and maybe some of the people in the audience might like to ask about that, but maybe that one's just for another time. So tell us about the bee's knees before we finish, because we did promise people that.
Well,
your recipe.
My recipe, and it's everyone's recipe, but I was introduced to the bee's knees several years ago, and I didn't like cocktails that much before, but I love this one. 2 ounces of gin, and make sure when you order it, you tell them to put gin, not vodka. And I like these gins, particularly Nolet's, Plymouth, Bloom, and Citadel. Those are the kind of gins that I like. And it's much like, I guess, a martini, but again, like I said, I don't drink martinis, but there's fresh lemon juice. And the trick really is honey simple syrup. And you make a simple syrup with half water, half of whatever your sweetener is, whether it's sugar or honey. A honey simple syrup is going to make a very different of honey flavor. Don't let them put regular simple syrups, because it's not going to be a bee's knees. But if you want to make your simple syrup and have a little flavor, add some lavender leaves or whatever, or ginger when you heat it up, and then you strain it out, and it'll give a nice little essence to the simple syrup. And then you shake them all together and make it in a kind of serve it up, as they say.
Cold.
And it's very refreshing. No ice, necessarily. And then a little lemon peel garnish.
Well, I have been sipping it very slowly, because I think had I had more than that, I wouldn't have been able to get to the end of the talk. It's quite strong. Anyway, thank you so much, Adrienne. That was wonderful. So I listened to Denise Morel's talk on the Harlem Renaissance exhibition. There's an online talk. And I think what you have told us tonight is very different. So I think you really brought a lot of context to it, which was fascinating to understand why it happened and how it happened, and what the sort of implications of it were, in a way that the exhibition focuses more on the artists themselves in the period. So thank you so much. That was really great.
I appreciate
and lovely to spend time with you again, Adrienne. I miss you here in London. We need you to come over and visit us again.
I will be back. Thank you.